The National Indigenous Women's Resource Center offers culturally grounded resources and materials to support tribal domestic violence programs and grassroots advocates. Learn more at niwrc.org/resources.
OCO, hello everyone. Welcome to Speaking Our Truth, podcast for change by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. I am your host, Leanne Pippin, and I'm a member of Cherokee Nation.
Hello, my name is Tia Bahajoni. I am a policy specialist with NIWRC.
Jane Anderson is a senior attorney advisor for AEquitas. AEquitas is a nonprofit organization focused on developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices related to gender-based violence and human trafficking. They are a team of former prosecutors with decades of experience working globally to hold offenders accountable and promote victim safety. Jane previously served as a prosecutor in Miami, where she tried many of Florida's first state-level human trafficking cases. She's worked with task forces to develop better policies and procedures to identify trafficking victims, provide services, and ensure offender accountability. Jane's experience in the courtroom and in developing policies and procedures, such as using digital evidence and strategic charging decisions, enables her to assist prosecutors and professionals in cases of domestic violence, stalking, sexual violence, human trafficking, and elder abuse. She currently provides training and technical assistance for investigations, case analysis, and trial strategy, as well as developing resources, publications, and training curricula.
We're also joined by Jennifer Landhuis. Jennifer is the director of the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, or SPARC, and she has over 25 years of experience as an educator and an advocate in the fields of stalking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. At SPARC, she leads the development of resources, collaborates with national partners, and provides training for criminal justice and victim service professionals. Prior to SPARC, Jennifer served as Director of Social Change at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, managing statewide initiatives and training programs. She also has over a decade of experience providing crisis intervention and advocacy at local domestic violence and sexual assault centers. Jennifer holds a BA in Youth and Family Ministry and an MS in Criminal Justice, and she teaches as an adjunct professor at Boise State University. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jane, for joining us on this episode of Speaking Our Truth, podcast for change. We're so happy that you're both here.
Thanks for having us.
So yeah, just before we get into the conversation of how both of these topics are connected, could you share the definitions of both stalking and sexual exploitation?
Sure, I'll start with the one that we use for stalking, which is that it is a pattern of behavior or a course of conduct that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to either fear for their safety or the safety of someone else or suffer substantial emotional distress.
Yeah, and that's a great behavioral definition, but the lawyer in me also wants to say that the criminal definition changes state by state. So you'd want to make sure you're looking at the right one, and AEquitas is something that can help you out with that. Sexual exploitation is an umbrella term that we use. So it might include things like sex trafficking, intimate partner sexual assault, or image-based sexual abuse, which might look like the unlawful or non-consensual distribution of intimate images, sextortion, or accompanying doxing.
And just for listeners who might not understand what doxing is, can you flesh that out just a little bit more?
Sure. Doxing is when not only are you experiencing maybe stalking and harassment and the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, but along with that, the offender is also putting out their private information, such as your full name, your address, your phone number. So it can sort of enhance the dangerousness of the other crimes for the victim involved.
It feels like, at least in a lot of the work that we do and speaking with survivors in general, there's always this like onus on the victim themselves to protect themselves. And that definitely can add a layer of stress and, fear to their
Absolutely.
everyday lives. And generally, it feels like people may view stalking as like, oh, this is happening between one person and their partner, and it's like between them, it's a personal thing. But reading through your resources, that's definitely not the case. Could you expand on the effects of stalking outside of that directed one-on-one impact?
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of different ways we can think about that. Number one, we often see that stalkers target other people besides the primary victim. So people that they know the victim holds close emotionally or figuratively. So it might be people like their family members or their children. Oftentimes they'll target coworkers, somebody that they know that the victim has a relationship with, or that the victim might be embarrassed if the behavior is spilling over to that person. So we see that behavior not only encompass that, primary victim, but other people that are close to the victim. And we also see that oftentimes offenders will engage other people in trying to target a victim. So it's a concept that we call proxy stalking. So they might use a family member, they might use the court system, they might use the Department of Health and Welfare. They're trying to have others engage in behavior that's going to essentially disturb the victim emotionally. And so they might do things like, call in a welfare check or report somebody to law enforcement or, engage in like frivolous court activities, take somebody back for custody hearings or revisit a civil protection order. That concept we call proxy stalking, when they're using that third party to engage in that stalking behavior. So not only do we see the stalking dispersed to other people, but we also see a lot of offenders who will engage other people in their activities.
Does that include if anybody interacts with someone's workplace?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we know a lot of times offenders will target a workplace because that's one thing that's really difficult for survivors to change. They might be able to stay with a relative or, vary their pattern to get back and forth to work, but they have to show up at their workplace, typically on a pretty firm pattern, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday or something like that. So offenders will oftentimes target a workplace, and depending on the laws in that state, depending on the workplace, oftentimes survivors are reluctant to tell anybody at work about what's been going on because they're fearful that if they do, their workplace might say something to them like, well, we don't need those kind of problems here. So, it's going to actually just be easier if we let you go. So we see a lot of offenders cause issues at work. And it can be really difficult, especially if a survivor works in a public facing place, like a restaurant or someplace that the offender has a excuse for being at. And that offender will try to leverage that excuse to say, well, it's a restaurant, it's a gym, it's a bar, I can show up here and I have the right to be here. So we see a lot of offenders that will actually target the victim's place of work. And then what happens in a lot of those cases is a survivor may end up losing their employment. And so now not only do we have somebody who's in fear for their safety, we have somebody who's in fear of not being able to have their basic needs met.
So how, for at least Indigenous communities, and it feels like a lot of the protection and like healing can come from within community. And I suppose my question is, how can loved ones respond to stalking victims? Like, how can they show up for them?
Jane, do you want to go first or do you want me to? Because I bet we both have ideas.
Well, I'm just thinking about, we're really lucky in the work that we do, that we work with those that have lived experience. And so we can talk to them and their expertise now and ask, what would help you? And honestly, I'm thinking about a recent presentation I co-facilitated with somebody with lived experience. And they said, it was the family support. It was the fact that it was taken seriously, and that family support was there to validate the fact that all of these little things that maybe one at a time didn't seem like all that serious, but the family member, the close friends saw the overall pattern and validated and supported the victim through that, even when maybe they're seeking other outside help and they're not getting that validation from them. So the family members and the community can be incredibly important for that.
I like that line of thinking that Jane brought up, because a lot of times what we see, especially in stalking incidents, is that the little things in and of themselves don't rise to a level that anybody's jumping in and doing something about them. And so the person who's experiencing that behavior tends to be looked at by outside people as either they're exaggerating or they're blowing things out of proportion. We hear a lot of people use the word paranoid when it comes to survivors of stalking. And I always like to shift people in their thinking to recognize hypervigilance for what it is. And that hypervigilance of constantly looking for signs of the offender and always thinking 2 steps ahead has actually been what's kept that survivor safe. But for people who live a safe life and you look at someone's behavior, they think that, that person's overreacting or that perhaps they're being paranoid about certain situations. And they don't recognize that it's actually hypervigilance and the effects of the stalking behavior.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense because these are things that you could almost perceive to be coincidences.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, oh, you just saw this person go by your workplace, or you just saw this person happen to go by where you hang out somewhere or something. But yeah, believing when someone says, I'm seeing this person, it's making me uncomfortable, or even just this one interaction. Yeah, it's enough to say, oh, you can't just brush it off as something else. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of offenders like to excuse it as a coincidence. So I just happened to show up at the baseball game at that particular moment in time. And oftentimes they're engaging in that particular behavior because they know it can be looked at as a mere coincidence. And then they try to gaslight a victim and make the victim look like they're the person who's just blowing things out of proportion.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why just to give a little background for our listeners, I saw the two of you present at a conference earlier this year. It was at the MUSAC's sex trafficking conference that happens every spring. It was this presentation on the intersections of stalking and sexual exploitation that really, it was so memorable for me. So I appreciate that you both are here chatting with us about it.
Yeah, and I think we see stalking intersect with, like you mentioned on the very beginning, with intimate partner violence. That seems like a natural intersection that we see. And then in the work that Jen does at Spark with her team, it's really expanding the idea of how else does stalking intersect with other crimes that we might be more readily identifying, but we're not seeing that stalking piece of it as well.
Yeah, well, that's a great sort of segue into, well, I hope it is. In my mind, it is.
I planned it that way to you.
So, in your collaborative work, you've laid out the elements of what you call surveillance, life invasion, interference through sabotage or attack. Can you explain that in terms of identifying those stalking behaviors?
No, I think that particular framework I found so helpful, even though I've been doing this work for a long time, because it really helped me kind of wrap my head around all the behaviors that we see happening in these particular situations. And we call that framework the SLY framework. And what we oftentimes see is if people identify that there's a stalking situation going on, both on the side of the survivor as well as on the side of people who are responding, it's typically because there's surveillance behavior happening, because that's kind of like the stereotypical understanding of stalking, where somebody's following you or watching you, et cetera. They're trying to get information about you. But what we've found is that a lot of times when we're working with survivors and we're asking them, tell me about the other incidents that have happened, what other harassing behaviors have happened, what other stalking behaviors have happened, we all think that that's the right question to ask. And what we've actually found is, because there's such that stereotypical understanding of what stalking is, that question isn't very helpful. And instead, if we're asking about specific behaviors, is this offender, invading your life? Are they showing up unwanted somewhere? Are they constantly calling you? Are they vandalizing your property? Are they harassing your friends and family? Or are they intimidating you? Are they, making some type of threats or, forcing a confrontation or threatening to harm themselves? Or if they're engaging in the interference, so they're sabotaging somebody's work or their relationships or their reputation within a community. Then if we ask about those specific tactics, the survivors are like, oh, yeah, absolutely, all that is happening. But to think about those as stalking behavior isn't a natural occurrence, not for survivors and not for those of us that are tasked with trying to keep them safe. And so when we are working on these particular issues, I think it's really helpful to expand our definition, help think about all the different tactics that an offender might engage in. Not only does that help us, criminal wise, with the eye to my lovely colleague Jane, as we're always thinking about prosecution, et cetera, but also, just as importantly, focusing on the safety planning. If we don't anticipate what might happen or what has happened, then we can't adequately safety plan around that. And so a lot of times people will focus on stalking safety plan and say things like, get a Ring camera, get a dog, tell your neighbors. And we don't necessarily think about all the other important parts of safety planning, not only from the emotional safety planning point of things, but also thinking about the breadth of behaviors and tactics that the offender might engage in. So we might not talk about things like, is this person monitoring your social media? Do we have to worry about your friends and family? Is there somebody that's vulnerable within your family that they might go after? And so that framework really allows us to not only expand what we can look at as far as accountability for the offender, but it also helps us enhance the victim safety side of things.
Yeah, and from the prosecutor's point of view, because I will bring that up, and law enforcement, it's such a valuable tool because a lot of times cases come to us because of one acute incident. So it might be an act of violence, it might be an act of vandalism, something that rose to a level high enough that the victim is asking for outside help. And then the focus then becomes on what was that acute incident that made you call 911 or want to make a police report in this particular incident. And because we are incident based in our responses, we'll start talking about, okay, what happened on this day in these 5 minutes. And one of the things that I love to point out about why stalking and sexual exploitation or sex trafficking have all of these commonalities is because they are both crimes that involve a course of conduct. And when we're talking about a course of conduct, we may be talking about a week, we may be talking about years. And it's very hard for us to identify all of the relevant information when we're speaking to somebody that has experienced various levels of this type of behavior, the SLY framework. Like, how do we capture that? And then not be overly focused on maybe the particular incidents that rose to the level of physical violence or rose to the level of a discrete criminal act. What the SLY framework does for me as a prosecutor is I want to use it as a tool. I want it in front of me so that when I'm working with law enforcement, I'm working with victims that are choosing to seek criminal justice and through that system. I want to be using that to make sure I'm asking all the questions because survivors and victims are also affected by how stalking is portrayed in the media. They might not identify that they're stalking victims. They might not think it's important to tell me about the one, Facebook message they got or the flowers that arrived on their doorstep or all these sort of smaller pieces. But for me, to provide context to the jury or the judge, which is the key in these cases, is figuring out the context in which all this happens. I need to have the skills and the resources to make sure I'm asking the right questions. And then I'm following through on whatever investigative means I can to corroborate each and every little piece of the overall puzzle. So the SLY framework for me is investigation leads, interview, and direct examination. And then again, like closing argument. I'm going to use this framework throughout the process of what I'm doing, responding to victims of stalking and sexual exploitation.
So when you say context, does that include like how well the victim may know or not know this person, or where
Absolutely.
they've experienced interactions?
Absolutely. So it's going to be, the relationship is going to be piece of the context to whatever level it is. And we see stalking, you do see the stranger stalking, to the barely known acquaintance, to the coworker, to the, jilted lover, to the intimate partner, and a lot in between of those. So that's going to be key to it. But it's also things like, what were if it was based on, let's say, a relationship at some point, what did that relationship look like? If it was an intimate partner relationship, were there specific threats, or are there certain dates or places that have special meaning? Those are all things that we'd want to know about as well.
Yeah, because I feel like if getting a bouquet of flowers on your birthday, like that's an entirely innocent and maybe celebratory thing, but to get flowers out of nowhere from someone you don't want to know, that can be incredibly triggering and terrifying for a person.
Yeah, or someone who, you didn't give your address to.
Yep.
Or that you don't want to recognize the fact that you're celebrating a birthday this week.
Mhm. So you touched a little bit on like the connection of these behaviors with exploitation. Can you go into that a little further? Like, can you explain how the path to exploitation is supported by those behaviors and patterns?
Sure. So I'm going to sort of discuss it in the framework of maybe sex trafficking. Um, so recruitment, right? So the SLY framework and stalking behaviors can be involved everywhere from that recruitment all the way through, right? So at recruitment, it could be that somebody is identifying and following someone online, that they're watching their online activity, that they're figuring out who their friends and family are. They're figuring out everything they can about that person, because that allows an offender, a trafficker, to then come in and fill gaps or make promises that are related to that particular victim's wants, needs, hopes, and dreams. So that could be part of how they're identifying and then recruiting a victim. And then through the course of a trafficking situation where there is force, fraud, and coercion used for either forcing commercial sexual activity, or we're focused on the sex trafficking part, but this could happen in a labor sense as well. So it could be forced labor services. Those tactics that are used to force someone, to coerce them, a lot of that is based on what the trafficker knows about the victim, right? What buttons to push, what threats are particularly effective, because the same tactics aren't going to work the same for different people, right? What's going to push my button or what's going to scare me might not scare someone else. So I think sometimes a real obvious one is that, I'm a US citizen. So threatening me with deportation is not a very effective threat. However, if a trafficker has identified, recruited, and is controlling someone that is undocumented, that might be the most effective threat to them. And so then gathering that information, tracking where they are, monitoring them with that threat over their head can be incredibly effective way to control and manipulate them. Similarly, when somebody is trying to maybe exit a situation of trafficking, how do, as a trafficker, prevent that person from disclosing or exiting the situation? That's going to be things that look like life invasion, showing up, having a sense that this person knows everything and knows where I am at all times. The fact that they might, be able to take away where I live. They might be able to threaten public humiliation. They might be able to, tell my friends and family what I've been involved with, to prevent me from wanting that to go, public in any way, through fear of disclosing that to others. So I think when we look at the SLY framework, you're talking about tactics. And then what I think Jen and I really like to do is say, okay, what is this general tactics that we call life invasion. Okay, life invasion, here's about 6, 7 examples of what that could be. And then given additional context, what might it look like for somebody that's also experienced sexual exploitation? Or what might it look like when somebody is from a community or a culture that is unique and special, right? Because offenders also, as part of all of this, there's this overlay of offenders misusing culture, religion, and things like that to be more effective in their threats and in their tactics.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I know that Spark has a really wonderful resource specific to Indigenous communities on stalking, and part of it touches upon the impact of cultural abuse and like using that in stalking or in this case sex exploitation, and just the threat of not being able to partake in ceremony simply because of a reputation being ruined possibly, or any of those sorts of threats to completely separate a person from their culture and identity is terrifying. Yeah.
Or if that person has like a significant role in your community and that reputation, you may be nervous could supersede anything that you might say against them. Why do you think victims find it difficult to seek help from law enforcement? Earlier in one of the answers, I started thinking about this too, because I think sometimes as women, there's always a fear that whatever you say will not be, I guess, listened to, or it could be brushed off as, yeah, being paranoid or something. So that usually that's the first one that comes to my mind when I think of like why do people find it difficult to seek help? And to me, I think the number one thing that I've noticed is, yeah, people don't think that they'll be listened to, or they don't think that they have enough information to give to somebody. So I'd love to hear what you all have seen and experienced of why victims find it difficult to seek help from law enforcement.
I think there's a couple of different reasons. I mean, I think the first one, like you said, could be prior interactions, and that fear that, I wasn't believed before. What would make things different now? I think the other thing that, especially with stalking crimes, is difficult is that the individual incidents that happen, like Jane said earlier, in and of themselves might not be a crime. So if you're just looking at that one specific incident, someone sending you flowers, someone showing up at a baseball game, that type of a thing, and you're not looking at it in its entire course of conduct, that people are worried that if they came forward, that they would just be focused on that one particular incident and wouldn't necessarily know the background and the context about that person or why I was so afraid. And so that might influence whether I decide to come forward or not. I mean, when we talk about stalking and reporting, a lot of times what we say is, it's one of those crimes that we essentially say back to victims, we need your help gathering all the evidence. And so we need you to document. We need anything, the screenshots that you have and the text messages and the emails, et cetera. And that's a lot of onus to put on someone. It's a traumatic thing. It's something that takes a lot of time and energy, and not something, survivors don't go to evidence class. They don't know what they're supposed to be gathering or what's important to bring forward. And so it really takes that time and effort on our part as responders to make sure that we're communicating what we need to go forward in these cases, that we're meeting survivors with the empathy and compassion for these particular cases, and understanding that we might be in for a long haul. Like, these are not going to be investigations that may easily be, finished in a week, but rather might take a while. And so I think that definitely influences people's decision about whether to come forward and report. They may have heard from other people about that interaction. I think the more that we can all continue to work with one another, advocates and parts of the criminal justice system and civil attorneys, et cetera, working together to make sure survivors have access to what they need is so important. And so someone might say, you know what, I don't want to choose to go forward with the criminal justice system, but I really want to make sure that a civil attorney can protect my privacy. And so really making sure that we're providing survivors with options, and making sure that if they choose to access the criminal justice system, that we're being transparent in our processes, helping people understand, what this is going to take, and then supporting them through that process. I always say to folks that we train, you can't necessarily control the outcome of a criminal justice system, but you can control how the way you treat a survivor. That is absolutely within your control. And so treating that survivor with the empathy and compassion during the process oftentimes can lead to greater contentment and happiness with the system than a conviction might. And so really making sure that we realize that we have that within our control. And that is something that we can continue to improve on. Because a lot of times people are like, oh, well, it's those, and they name whatever part of the system they're frustrated with, right? And instead really taking a step back to see, how do we own our own behavior, and how are we working together? And how are we working individually with the survivors that come forward?
You're so right, Jen. I just want to put like a button on it, because when we are working with our advisory councils of folks with lived experience, we will often ask, what would you want law enforcement to know, and how would you advise them to like improve their response? And I think it's across the board, universal, that survivors will say, I just wanted to be listened to, treated like a human, and be told the truth. So transparency is a big piece of that. And so those are things that you're 100% right. We can control those things. There's lots of things that we cannot control, but we can at least do that. And the other thing I just want to say is that I think survivors are reporting to police. They just might not be using the words.
Yeah.
So they're reporting, like I said, maybe property damage, or maybe something that's being identified as a domestic violence incident, or any number of things. And we're not putting together the pieces, right? And it's unfortunate, but because these things can cross over venues and jurisdictions, because it's a lot of different incident reports that, we don't have a magic machine like they show on TV and in movies that connects all those dots immediately for us. And so law enforcement might not be able to immediately see the big picture that this victim has actually filed other reports in other jurisdictions about other types of behavior. So also like incumbent upon us to do a better job of putting together those pieces and trying to take some of the burden off the victims, because as Jen said, like oftentimes we are asking them to sort of put together their own cases. And so always striving to maybe improve that piece of things.
I see the implementation of like the advisory group, or, people with lived experience and their suggestions and their recommendations in the real world. Like you go to courthouses now and you have advocates who will be in the courthouse. Like they don't have to be called in. They have like offices within the justice system buildings, and they're there ready to help survivors in whatever capacity, whatever is needed in the moment. And I think for survivors to be able to see that it's all connected, that it's not just these sort of like siloed professionals in different spaces doing their own thing. It's like this is a collective group supporting you and supporting your healing and your protection. And I think that's incredible.
I'm glad to hear that you're seeing that, because that's what I think a lot of us are striving to achieve.
Oftentimes survivors might decide, if they don't want to access the criminal justice system, they might yet access the civil justice system. So that might be a civil attorney that's helping with like a civil protection order, somebody who might help with like divorce and custody, somebody who might be doing like privacy protections, representing the survivor in like a sexual assault situation. So I think it's important for people to remember that there are different options that survivors can pursue. And it's about helping them figure out, how do they access it, and how do we make it accessible to them? Because, finances and isolation and geography can play a big piece into that.
Totally. Thank you. We're going to shift a little to just technology. So there's a lot of emerging tactics now used by abusers, namely technology has been an added challenge with deep fakes and even trackers. What are emerging risks when it comes to technology that may not be as well known?
I would say that From the technology standpoint, anything that exists as far as technology can be used nefariously. And so things like social media, even text messages, all these things that exist out there, it's not the technology itself that's bad. It's how these offenders are manipulating that technology and using it to their advantage to gain power over someone else. And so what I would say is, as the technology continues to shift, it also requires us to be thinking creatively about accountability options and creatively thinking about safety options for victims as well.
Yeah, I'm glad that you started off with like everything. I honestly do think about anytime there's like a new piece of tech, a new app, I immediately get into the mode of like, how could this be misused? And I don't want to be out there saying like tech is bad, because it's not. It serves so many purposes. And I think even in COVID, we learned that technology could really improve how we could serve victims and have like more accessible resources to like maybe more rural areas. So I'm a fan of technology, but I do always have that little piece of me that's like, how could this be misused? So the joke that I talk about is, the Wi-Fi enabled refrigerator, where you can like look in and see if you need to buy new milk. Well, obviously somebody could have access to that and use that little bit of information to be like, oh, I see you didn't get your milk, or I see you did get your milk, or you're a terrible person because you're not getting milk for your family. So I always think about that, but I also want to reassure people that, well, maybe two things. One is that, no tech is ever going to be perfect. I was recently interviewed for folks were talking about how women in particular who are like maybe joggers or runners, how could they keep themselves safe? And I said, I never would want to tell someone that a piece of technology could keep them safe, because the reality is that if somebody is looking to harm you with technology or without technology, offenders are incredibly resourceful and creative. And I don't want to use those words in a positive light. The thing that we need to be doing is we need to keep ourselves educated about the evolving technology. We need to keep ourselves thinking about all the different collateral consequences of technology that might seemingly have really great benefits, and just always be thinking about the other side, and then incorporating what we know in our tech safety planning and in our ability to identify and preserve evidence that we could put in front of a court, and also be prepared to educate the court about those new and emerging trends.
Yeah, because that's the other thing is, because everything you can kind of track online, that's kind of the flip side, where it's like you can use that to help document, your experiences and the stuff that other people have done. Yeah, because I've heard many times also about, air tags being misused. Those are great if you lose your suitcase and you need to find it, but those can also be slipped on a person or in someone's belongings very discreetly.
I appreciate that, those, like Apple and Samsung and anyone who has sort of those trackers or creating those trackers, they saw the misuse of them and they've created responses to those misuses. That's also sort of like heartening to see that it's being taken seriously in some areas of technology. Of like, oh, okay, we have to respond. We have to protect the people that buy these or who could be affected by them. Are there any other sort of like emerging issues or tactics that maybe you're sort of creating and developing resources for?
Well, I think it's a hot topic, AI. And I think most people are just like saying AI and going, oh, this is an emerging trend. And it's like, okay, well, let's think about it a little bit deeper, right? So in the context of what we're talking about, stalking and sexual exploitation, one of the trends that the law really hasn't kept up on is that laws that are addressed, like the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, there are statutes that are meant to address that, which would not address deep fakes or AI created images. So there are only a handful of states that have rewritten or written their statutes that would address the fact that, like, what if it's my face but it's not my body, but everyone thinks it is in this image or video that's being put out there. So a couple of states have have come up and included that AI language in their statutes, but there are a lot of states that haven't. So as we talk about emerging trends, it's not just the tech, but it's like, how is the law keeping up with that? So that's something that we're constantly sort of looking at. It came up in the context of like video voyeurism, because as cameras got smaller and smaller, there was a case where somebody had a camera on the top of their shoe and they were walking underneath, putting their shoe on public escalators and capturing video up the skirts of young girls. Well, the statute always historically said that video voyeurism was also only a crime if the video was in a place where you had an expectation of privacy. And this guy, he was taking these videos in a subway, in a mall, where there is no expectation of privacy. So the law did not address his criminal behavior. So the law had to be rewritten. So we see that a lot as far as kind of keeping up on things and emerging trends.
That is interesting, because when I think of like, if cameras are everywhere, wouldn't you then say that you have a reasonable right to privacy everywhere?
Oh, yes. So what they did is they rewrote it and said, not only is it the location, because, typically it would be like, oh, well, the secret camera was in a bathroom, or the secret camera was like in a locker room or changing room. So now it's the place of privacy is the place on your body that is private. So it is the fact that it's capturing up your skirt is the reasonable expectation of privacy now. But they had to change the law.
That is interesting, because isn't there a Beatles song where they talk about the mirrors on the shoes that people used to do back in the day? It's like, it's not a new thing, but now it's a camera.
I'm gonna have to look up that Beatles song. One of our colleagues has a great music list of songs that talk about stalking. I'll have to make sure Dana has the mirrors on the shoe one.
Yes.
I'm wondering, for many Native communities, the communities themselves are smaller and everyone knows everyone. Which might not be unique to just Native communities, but basically the victims of persistent violence like stalking must live within close proximity to their abuser. Do you notice that there are more unique responses to stalking that Native victims and their families can consider?
I mean, I would take that and I would flip that. And also that, yes, because of the proximity and because of the relationships, that might pose difficult, but it's also a real opportunity for accountability, because then you have an entire community that is addressing the behavior and not just a survivor on their own. And so I think while it certainly can create some barriers, there's also some opportunities to leverage that same community. A lot of the work that we've seen in restorative justice works because it's being done in communities where accountability is an option, where people do know each other and they can hold that offender accountable for their actions. So I think that is one of the unique things that we can look at as far as, justice for survivors. I think it's also really important to just make sure that we're including survivors in that conversation about what justice looks like for them. And so for a lot of survivors, those unique dynamics might be leveraged to also help them improve their safety, because then there's an entire community that's helping with that.
I think that is a huge barrier sometimes, is when everybody knows each other. Yeah, people may feel more obligated to protect somebody over somebody else. So it really does kind of put a lot of the responsibility on your community to be supportive of each other and hold each other accountable too. I think if somebody else is witnessing these behaviors, you should, do something to help, because if it's happening in your community and everybody's around, the chances are it's not happening in a vacuum. Chances are other people have witnessed things too.
Yeah. And for, as a practitioner who's not Native and doesn't work in a place that has Native land, I still acknowledge that there are a lot of urban Natives as well, right? So for me, as a prosecutor, I want to make sure that I'm asking the questions in a way that is expressing cultural humility. So, what does that mean to you is something that we ask. That's a great question to ask anybody, honestly. What did that mean to you? And not making assumptions. And I think that's one of the things I'll talk about prosecutors. I'll be the one that gives us a little bit of a hard time. But prosecutors, our culture is not one where we're supposed to ever admit that we don't know something. And so we might be making assumptions, and we might be thinking, okay, this is what this person must be feeling. This is what this person must be afraid of. This is what this person must want. And so for always to be remembering that you're going to get the most valuable information and you're going to be able to provide the best response if you approach it from the position of like, I don't know, I want to know, and I value what you're able to tell me about the situation.
What is something that could benefit them knowing, or is there any action that they can take to be a better ally for victims?
We actually do have a resource on Spark's website for friends and loved ones on how to support survivors of stalking. So I would definitely point to that as one particular resource. That resource essentially says, believe the survivor, offer a non-judgmental space for that person, offer to assist with what you have to be able to assist with, if that's emotional support, if that's financial support, if that's, accompanied someone somewhere. I think like Jane said, we ask responders to come to the table by making sure that they have an open mind and believe, survivors. And I would ask the same thing of loved ones and family members, is to approach that with listening to the survivor and hearing what they have to say and figuring out how do you best support them going forward. So I think although it sounds, I don't want it to sound trite, but to start by believing what they have to say and figuring out what you can do to support them is so important.
Yeah, I think identifying existing resources, and sometimes it's not a perfect fit. I'm surprised she hasn't said it already, but Jen will often talk about that there aren't a lot of stalking specific resources. So if you're experiencing stalking that doesn't also look like sexual violence or also look like domestic violence, you might have a harder time finding resources. But to then leverage other resources that might be specific to your community or your culture. So trying to identify who is that support network. We're trying to also help when it comes to that civil piece. I love that you've already mentioned that a lot of family justice centers or courtrooms where folks are seeking protection orders, where there are advocates that are being that are just housed in the courthouse. So taking advantage of that, I think sometimes we assume people know that there are these resources and how to navigate them. And so helping point those out and navigating them with someone can be really great from my perspective, because I always want to bring, it back to the fact that law enforcement and prosecutors need to do so much more. I think that this is a place where we need to be better at looking beyond like incident-based responses. So my action item would be to always be thinking about when somebody is disclosing to you something that's occurred, that's happened, and you see that there is some sort of interpersonal relationship or people know one another, to always be asking questions that can open up the conversation and provide you more information about the context. Because once that conversation opens up beyond, that one incident that brought them maybe to be in front of you, that's when you're going to get the really key information of the SLIDE framework or the force, fraud, and coercion tactics that are being used. And that's when you're going to be able to build a more robust response.
Well, thank you both, Jennifer and Jane, for joining us. I thought that was a really wonderful conversation.
Well, it was great chatting with you guys. You guys asked great questions, and learning from you and the perspective that you bring to these topics enhances the work that we're all able to do. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you. To everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. Take care.